Welcome back to Occult Archives, everybody. We're diving back into the world of forbidden texts today, unearthing the stories behind history's most feared books. We're talking grimoires, ancient manuscripts, the kind of stuff that was once whispered about in hushed tones.
The stuff that, if you read it, you might summon something terrible.
Right, like, is it all real? Are these just stories? Or is there something more going on here?
Yeah, and I think that's what's always fascinated people about these books, the possibility that they hold some kind of real power or knowledge that's been hidden away, maybe even intentionally.
And today's deep dive is into one that definitely has that aura around it. A book called The Book of Ceremonial Magic by Arthur Edward Waite.
Now, Waite himself wasn't exactly a stranger to the world of the occult. He was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a pretty influential group in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Oh yeah, that's the group that Aleister Crowley was part of for a while, right?
Right, and they were all about this blend of Western esoteric traditions, things like alchemy, Kabbalah, tarot, and of course ceremonial magic.
So Wheat was writing from a place of experience, not just as some armchair scholar.
Exactly. And in this book, he takes on a massive task, trying to analyze and make sense of this whole universe of magical literature, from the stuff that was published openly to the really obscure manuscripts hidden away in libraries.
Okay, so let's set the stage here a bit. When we talk about ceremonial magic, what are we actually talking about? What kind of practices does that encompass?
Well, basically, it's a system of magic that relies heavily on rituals, symbols, specific words of power, often invocations of spirits. It's very structured with a lot of emphasis on doing things precisely the right way to achieve the desired effect.
We're not just talking about like casting spells and waving wands.
Not exactly. There's definitely an element of that, but it's more about creating these complex ritual spaces, invoking entities, drawing on these established hierarchies of spirits and powers.
It sounds kind of like a combination of religious ceremony and, well, calling upon supernatural forces.
Right, and that's one of the interesting things about ceremonial magic, this intersection of spiritual devotion and magical practice. It draws on elements from religious traditions like Christianity and Judaism, but it often takes them in a direction that those religions might not exactly approve of.
So Waite starts off his book by talking about the importance of printed texts, right?
Yeah, he argues that the printed books are where we can really see the historical impact of ceremonial magic because they had a much wider reach. Anybody who could read could potentially get their hands on these books and study them.
Right. But he also acknowledges these handwritten manuscripts, the kind of stuff that's locked away in libraries.
Exactly. And those manuscripts are interesting because they give us a glimpse into this more hidden, maybe even secret side of magical practice.
And what Waite finds is that almost all of these manuscripts, going back centuries, seem to be drawing inspiration from this one core source, the Key of Solomon.
The Key of Solomon is kind of like the granddaddy of Western ceremonial magic texts. It claims to contain the magical knowledge of King Solomon himself, detailing all sorts of rituals for invoking spirits, creating talismans, and achieving various magical goals.
And because it was so influential, a lot of these later manuscripts were basically variations on its themes.
Exactly. But even with this shared source, Waite identifies three specific groups of manuscripts that he found particularly interesting.
All right, let's hear about them. Group number one.
Okay, group number one is connected to a figure named Honorius. The most important manuscript in this group is called Sloane 313, a Latin text from the 14th century.
And this Sloane 313 seems to be the sworn Book of Honorius. What's that all about?
Well, according to the book itself, it was compiled by this guy, Honorius, who was allegedly the representative of a group of, get this, 811 masters of magic.
811, that's a lot of magicians.
Yeah, like some kind of massive magical convention. And supposedly, Honorius, after consulting with an angel, condensed their combined knowledge into 93 chapters for this sworn book.
So it's kind of like the minutes from the world's first magic conference.
Right, although probably not as boring as your average conference minutes. The thing is, this sworn book gets linked to a much later book, the Grimoire of Honorius, which is a straight-up black magic grimoire.
And how does that connection happen?
It seems like there was this original Honorius, a magician, who somehow, through all these evolving stories, gets mistaken for a pope of the same name.
So this sworn book might actually give us a clue as to why a book of black magic was later attributed to a pope.
Yeah, it might be an early example of someone trying to give their magic book more authority by linking it to a powerful figure.
And this sworn book, does it lean more towards white magic or black magic?
It's interesting. It seems to mix both white and black magic practices without actually talking about making deals with the devil.
So maybe an earlier, less rigidly defined version of magical practice.
That's what Waite suggests, that maybe these guys were drawing from the same Solomonic sources but hadn't really separated things out into good and evil magic yet.
Fascinating. Okay, what's group number 2?
Group number 2 is the Sefer Raziel. We find 2 versions of this in the Sloan collection, both attributed to, guess who, King Solomon.
Solomon again. This guy gets around.
Right. It's like he's the Elvis of magical texts. Anyway, manuscript 3826 is a 16th century English translation of a lost Latin original. It's this fascinating story. Supposedly, it was sent to Solomon by a Babylonian prince carried by 2 wise men.
Okay, so now we're getting into some serious mystical provenance here.
Right. And the very first section is called Clavis, which is Latin for key. If this text is indeed older than the famous Claviculae, the Keys of Solomon, it might explain why the concept of a key became so important to Solomon's magical tradition.
Like the key to unlocking his secret wisdom.
Exactly. Now, this particular clavis is all about the magical influence of the stars, emphasizing how crucial they are for any successful magic.
So already we're seeing this strong integration of astrology into magical practice.
Right. And the Sefer Raziel goes on to cover all sorts of stuff, like the powers of stones, herbs, animals, the use of incense and rituals, which, by the way, also connects back to that sworn Book of Honorius, as well as the best times to perform magic, the importance of purification, the nature of angels, and even the power within names.
That's like a comprehensive guide to magical living.
Yeah, and the other Latin version, Sloan 3853, is shorter but has some really rare magical symbols. It shows how these traditions evolved and changed over time.
Okay, what's the third group of manuscripts Waite mentioned?
The third group is all about the Lemegeton, which is also known as the Lesser Key of Solomon.
The lesser key, so there's a bigger one too.
Yeah, there's the Greater Key and the Lesser Key, both attributed to Solomon, of course.
Of course, what's the difference between the two?
The Greater Key is more about making talismans and working with what are considered benevolent spirits. It does involve things like animal sacrifice, though, and there's this sense of, like, anxiety about what these spirits might look like if you actually manage to summon them. But importantly, the Greater Key forbids using magic to harm others.
Okay, so it's like the ethical version of Solomonic magic.
You could say that. It might represent a later, more, I don't know, refined approach to the whole thing.
Interesting. So what about this lesser key, the Lemegeton?
The Lemegeton is a whole different beast. It's got instructions on how to summon 72 different demons.
Okay, so definitely not the ethical version.
Not so much. The Lemegeton doesn't really get into philosophy or doctrine or anything like that. It's more of a practical manual. It gives you the names of these demons, their ranks in the infernal hierarchy, their powers, and then step-by-step instructions on how to conjure them.
A kind of demonic cookbook.
Exactly. And Waite thought that the first part, the Goetia, might have been the original core of the Lemegeton, and that the later parts, like the Pauline Art and the Almudel, were added later.
What are those other parts about?
The Pauline Art is about summoning angels.
Angels?
Mm-hmm.
Really? So it's not all just demons in this Lemegeton.
Not all demons, no. It's interesting, right? You've got these two seemingly opposite forces, demons and angels, all mixed up in the same text.
Like maybe the idea was that a skilled magician could command both types of entities.
Yeah, and use them for different purposes. The Almudel is about creating these wax tablets and using them to summon spirits. It gets really complex with the timing and the astrological correspondences and all that.
So we've got these two main Solomonic texts, the Greater Key and the Lesser Key, and then all these other manuscripts drawing on those ideas. It sounds like a pretty big and complicated world of magical practice.
Oh yeah, it's a huge world, and Waite dives deep into it. He doesn't just describe the rituals and stuff. He really gets into the mindset of the people who are practicing this magic.
And what was their mindset? What were they trying to achieve with all of this?
Well, some of them were definitely seeking power, you know, the ability to control spirits, to influence events, to gain wealth and influence. Others might have been more focused on acquiring knowledge or achieving some kind of spiritual enlightenment.
Right. And then there's the whole question of good and evil.
Exactly. Because even within ceremonial magic, there's this ongoing debate about what's considered ethical or not. Like, is it okay to work with demons at all, even if you're supposedly controlling them?
Yeah, and who gets to decide where that line is drawn?
Right. It's a complex subject, and Waite doesn't shy away from exploring those complexities.
This has been a really fascinating look at the world of ceremonial magic and these ancient texts that have shaped it.
Yeah, it really gives you a sense of just how much depth and history there is to this stuff.
For those who are interested in exploring this further, where would you suggest they start?
Well, obviously, the Book of Ceremonial Magic itself is a great place to start, even if it can be a bit dense at times. There are also a number of other books and resources available that delve into specific aspects of ceremonial magic, like the Keys of Solomon, the Lemegeton, and the various grimoires.
And what about those who want to go beyond the books? Are there any modern-day groups or traditions that carry on these practices?
Oh, absolutely. There are still groups and individuals who practice ceremonial magic today, drawing on these ancient traditions and adapting them for modern times. Some of them are more focused on the spiritual aspects, while others are more interested in the practical applications. It really depends on who you talk to.
Okay, so for our listeners who might be intrigued by all of this, but also a little, well, spooked, what would you say to them?
Well, I'd say that ceremonial magic is a powerful system, and it's not something to be taken lightly. But it's also a fascinating and complex world, full of history, symbolism, and mystery. If you're curious, explore it, but do so with respect and caution.
Wise words. Thanks for taking us on this deep dive into the world of ceremonial magic.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And for our listeners, until next time, keep exploring the occult archives.